two on the cat.
That's lucky that there were two, because I was about to talk.
Must never talk over the cat, Wem.
Don't talk over the cat.
My cat keeps deciding at 3 o'clock in the morning to incessantly meow. Just
Same.
And it's like but he has like a smoke alarm. Just goes meow, 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 meow.
Well, also at 3 a.m, mine goes meow, meow, and then scratch on the carpet really loudly and deliberately. Meow. So why is that? Why are our cats so haunted?
I don't know.
Coming equinox. It's Imbolc. They know it's Imbolc.
Well, it will have been Imbolc. You're giving away when we're recording.
What's wrong with that?
This is coming out later. We have to pretend that it's. Oh yeah, I suppose.
No, it's been Imbolc. That's fine.
It's been Imbolc.
You've reverse time traveled there. Listeners, we've got a really good interview coming up. A really lovely guest.
Good.
Oh, we love her.
Look,
it's Naomi Fisher talking about her new book, Teenager's Guide to Burnout. And just such juicy chats. But before we get into it, can I just say a heartfelt thank you to Chandra from Bush Pods in South Australia, right? Because she sent us a lovely voice note after our last episode, which we decided was the beginning of season 2, didn't we?
Season 2. We're new people now.
Yeah, exactly. Because in there's some quite personal moments. I'm not going to name the moment.
You were very vulnerable.
I was vulnerable and open with our listeners. And then afterwards,
so open.
And then afterwards, I was like, oh my goodness, I can't believe we're releasing this episode of the podcast. What am I thinking? What's going on in my life? But then you were very kindly like, we can edit it, we can take it down. And I was like, I just don't know. And then she messaged and was like, I've never laughed so hard in my life. Thank you for that. You guys are great. So thank you, Chandra. I think you're great. And thank you for taking the time to reassure my anxious mind that it's worth sharing these moments. Yeah. So thank you to you in South Australia. And listeners, if anyone, thinks that they want this kind of content and it's worth money, just pay us on Patreon for more.
Look, the people that donate on Patreon are incredibly generous and are supporting this. And also part of what they're doing is meaning that if you're listening to this and you're not on the Patreon, it's because of those guys. Those guys in there have paid for our equipment. They pay for our software to keep doing this, for our website hosting. If you want to donate on Patreon, you are helping to bring this kind of waffle chat, these kind of interviews to people who maybe don't have the means to fund it right now. So we are incredibly grateful, not just personally to be getting these donations, but to be able to have these people who are yes, please keep making this. Please keep putting it into the world.
Exactly. And it's not a lot of money a month for people, but it means a lot to us
which is why I'm writing everybody that signs up to Patreon, I write them a little personal, lovely postcard and I post it out to people. So handwritten postcards come to anybody that's supporting us on Patreon. So patreon.com/Forest School Podcast. We are still looking for, I think next episode we'll probably have some bits in there for wasn't on the job description. So if you have a mad story situation that you want to submit and be like, this should be on the outdoor leader, Forest School leader job description, get those in. You can find us on all the social media channels. You can find us YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, TikToks. I don't use the TikTok very much. Or you can email admin@theforestschoolpodcast.com or go to the website, theforestschoolpodcast.com. There's contact forms all over there. And yeah, let's get into the interview, Em. Let's do the thing.
Enjoy the words that follow.
The Forest School Podcast is proudly sponsored by Tensile. As Forest School leaders, Wem and I know how important it is to provide a space where children can regulate their emotions and get the sensory input they need, even in challenging weather. We've always loved using hammocks for their calming, swaying motion, but let's be honest, they're no good in wind, rain or snow. That's why we're so excited about the Tensile Stingray. It's completely weatherproof and offers all the benefits of a hammock while keeping everyone warm, dry and comfortable. We've had kids use the Stingray in all kinds of weather, wind, rain, and even snow, and it's become a favourite place for them to warm up, re-engage, and find calm. With a 400 kilo weight limit, it's incredibly sturdy and provides plenty of space for kids to feel secure, while its no-seer mesh keeps out bugs, and the 5008H rainfly handles even the heaviest downpours. Because it's elevated off the ground, the Stingray stays warm and dry even on frosty mornings. Plus, the gentle sway helps children self-regulate and reconnect with the group on their own terms. It's been a total game changer for our sessions, allowing us to provide an engaging and sensory-friendly retreat in all weather conditions. If you're looking for a durable, portable, and weatherproof solution, we can't recommend the Tensile Stingray enough. Use the referral code FORESTCHILDREN10 to get a 10% discount and support the podcast. Makes me nervous when it counts down.
Listeners, we have got Naomi Fisher back again. We are very, very pleased to be speaking with Naomi again. We spoke to you, Naomi, a while back about your book, A Different Way to Learn, didn't we?
Yeah.
So listeners, if you haven't listened to that episode, heartily recommend it. And now Naomi's joining us to talk about The Teenager's Guide to Burnout, Finding the Road to Recovery, which you have co-authored with Eliza Fricker, haven't you? She's done the illustrations.
Right.
And so we've obviously read the book, and
do you want me to do the thing? Look, I've got all the sticky with the.
You've got the sticky notes.
Look,
we can compare our books. I got mine, but mine doesn't have sticky notes in it.
It's got the sticky notes of me, and then the front page that's covered in scribbles is when.
That's me.
Brilliant.
That's me.
That's a well-used copy of that book. Yeah.
It is, and I just wanted to speak first about the term burnout, first of all, before we get into the book, because obviously the book is aimed at teenagers, and you describe what it feels like to be in burnout really clearly, and it's really easy to understand that and to kind of almost not self-diagnose, but kind of self-assess and go, am I there yet? Maybe I'm not quite there. And that's one of the really great things about the book. And it's a word, burnout, that we hear quite a lot around at the moment on social media and things like that. And you reference a point in one bit in the book, you say that people refer to autistic burnout, and actually you're not going to use that term necessarily, it's just a more broad term. But I wondered about where burnout sits as compared to phrases like depression and anxiety, or having a nervous breakdown, or having a breakdown, and whether it is the same or whether it is an actual specific different thing that is now clinically recognised. I just wondered what your kind of psychological perspective on that was.
Yeah, so the World Health Organization say that it's not a medical problem, that it's not, so that they say that it is different to a diagnosis of depression or anxiety or anything else. And they say that's because they see it as an occupational phenomena, not a medical phenomena. So it actually means that they're basically saying this is the response of humans to chronic stress over a long period of time where you can't get away from it. And of course, they are thinking about it just about in terms of jobs. In fact, they say it has to be jobs. Occupational phenomena must be employment, which makes no sense to me, because school is one thing and whether it should be expended to children, but for example, caring responsibilities or parenting, just because it's not paid employment doesn't mean that one can't be burnt out by it. So essentially what they're saying is it is different. It's not the same as depression or anxiety or those kind of diagnoses which would generally come under healthcare, because it should be seen as an occupational problem. Essentially, and I really like that actually that they've said that, because I think what they're saying there really is this isn't something that we should be fixing the people and then sending them back. It's not like we should be giving them therapy and then putting them back into the same situation, because the problem is what's happening, the occupation. The problem is what's happening in the environment, and the person is responding. And I think I say that in the book, that burnout is our body's way of going, no more. This is too much. And then the way that burnout can be expressed includes a whole range of different things. So I think somebody could be depressed whilst in burnout, or highly anxious whilst in burnout, because it's not so much the symptoms of it that define it as burnout. It's more that it's the body's response to chronic stress, where you can no longer get yourself back to a state of being okay.
Yeah. And I think that message comes through really clearly in the book, that you are saying it's not a problem with you, the reader, it's a problem with your environment. And and that comes across strongly in both the message to the teenagers, but also in the chapter at the end directed at parents and adults who are caring for people, that actually just kind of getting people better, as you say, and then plonking them back in the same environment actually isn't going to work, and it's a different thing. And that's quite groundbreaking, isn't it? That's quite a different perspective to anything that we might hear in anywhere else. It's an absolute, I find the book like a real, it's the antithesis of those Tory government adverts of, she said she had a stomachache this morning and look at her now.
God.
She's
It's
fine.
just,
Oh.
oh my God. They were so awful. Yeah.
And I think it is groundbreaking in saying this message for teenagers, because there are books for adults about burnout which will say maybe you need to reevaluate what you're doing with your life. Maybe you need to, and people do this all the time, don't they? Adults do this all the time. We reevaluate. We're like, oh, actually, maybe the career I thought I wanted isn't actually the right career for me, and I might have to go and do something else. Or I'm going to reevaluate, whether I want to be working full time. Even we're allowed to make all of those evaluations as adults, but children and teenagers, it's like we drive them through. This must be the only way. You must carry on doing this, and if you're not thriving in this environment, the problem is you, not the school. Which, when you start to think about it, just makes no sense. Like, it wouldn't make no sense if we did the same to adults, would it? You say everybody's got to do the same job 5 days a week, no flexibility, and if you can't do it, it's on you. Try harder.
Oh man, was there because you're saying that this stuff has been out there for adults for a while, and it's kind of unique now that we're getting this stuff for teenagers. Was there a scenario or something that made you go, teenagers need this right now in this moment in time? And like, is it teenagers because education up to that point, teenagers the boiling point? Is there something about teenagehood that particularly was like, that's the one I want to go for right now?
I think that this generation of teenagers has had a particularly hard run. They've had COVID, which I think was really tough on a lot of them. They've had an increasingly controlling school environment. They've had a very different education system to the one that I went through, for example, one that has a lot more testing, a lot more pressure. I think they have grown up in a time of austerity, of, feeling that there's a lot that has gone on for this generation of teenagers. And I think it's not surprising that they perhaps are more vulnerable to stress as a result of that. But I also think that the adults have failed to really grapple with the implications of that. Instead, what adults have done, what schools have done generally, is keep them pushing through the same old thing. And I think our education system has become increasingly focused on age 16 GCSEs, make or break. If you don't make it, you're over, really. And that's certainly the message that I hear from lots of teenagers, that they just think it's all about those GCSEs, and if I don't get them, my life is going to be over. Which, and I mean, again, when I talk quite a bit about my own experience in the book, my own experience of school attendance difficulties, and what would now maybe I might think about as burnout, but I didn't think about it like that at the time at all. And I just think that we've created this scenario for our teenagers where everything is about doing well. And they've got, and it, again, it's one of these things which you think, if it was for adults, we would not be surprised if loads of them were caving under the pressure. But with teenagers, we don't give them that grace to have that time, because it's this obsession with being behind, isn't it? In fact, I had this moment because I lived in France for 2 years where they don't do GCSEs, and I was at an alternative school in France with a parents' meeting, and I was hearing them all talk about their teenagers and very similar difficulties to the teenagers have here. But I realised that they don't have that age 16 pressure. And therefore, they were less panicky about their 14 and 15-year-olds than people in the UK are. So people in the UK, if your 15-year-old or your 14-year-old isn't going to school, you're generally in a state of very, very high anxiety. Whereas in France, they weren't happy about it, but they felt like, they've got until 18 or 19 before the crux point comes in. And we've built this system in the UK which has these crux points, which just mean you can't step off it.
Yeah. Well, I kind of wrote in the notes that this is a kind of potentially incendiary book, right? Because you're essentially telling teenagers,
not like
"Do you
your
know
other books,
what?
Naomi. The other books.
No. I'm
This
usually
is
really
you.
just smooth things over. That's what I
You
do
don't
in
like
my
to rock
books.
the boat. That's the
Just toeing
thing.
the line."
Yeah.
About like explaining, so explaining burnout, explaining how you get there, and then explaining, do you know what, actually school is not the only way, and people will tell you it's illegal not to go to school, however it isn't, and it's like all these phrases that you quote adults, it's like you hear people using those phrases all the time, and you're literally pointing out that's incorrect. Even if your parent tells you they'll get fined if you don't go to school, that's incorrect. If they tell you this, that's incorrect. And sort of really empowering teenagers with this knowledge. I think it's part of it, isn't it? Because you explain how part of the road out of burnout is to feel like you're in the driving seat of your own life. So to tell teenagers the truth about that, and to also then back it up with the case studies, as you have done, of adults or young adults who have gone through a difficult time at school or gone an alternative route and now they're okay, and how they've managed to educate themselves or follow their own interests and make it viable for them to then make a living, kind of backs up what you're saying there. Because I think if you didn't have those case studies, reading it as a teenager, I might still feel very anxious and go, that's all very well for you to say, but what will happen? I'll be a failure. I'll be homeless, all this sort of stuff. Was that always part of your plan to have those case studies in there?
To be incendiary or to have... Yes.
Both.
No,
both.
I knew that it was a very incendiary book, actually, and I was quite scared about publishing it because it came very much... So one of the things that drove me to write it was people say all the time, we want something for our teenagers, we've got nothing for them, and we can tell them stuff, but it doesn't make any difference. We want them, they need to hear it from somewhere else. And that's why the case studies came in, because I think, there is only so much telling people you can do. You need to show them, and actual real stories show people stuff. And I think teenagers in particular need to be shown stuff. And I think that's just showing them respect, really, that they need to be, they need to actually have proper evidence that, okay, maybe it doesn't have to be like this. But yes, and I mean, my chapter for the parents at the end acknowledges that this is an incendiary book. It is a different book. And I think what has been surprising to me is how well it's done, but also how many parents have been like, this is what we've been looking for. We really need to, because I know there are loads of books out there basically trying to convince teenagers that going back to school is the right thing to do. I've read them. When I was doing my research, I was looking at there are loads of books which are kind of sort of try and convince them that school's a good thing, really, or they kind of try and just put around the issue, like not really get into it, And I was just like, no. I know what I needed as a teenager, and I needed someone to say, you know what, the problem's not you. It could be the system. And there's nothing out like that. There's nothing there for teenagers like that. So that was where it came from.
There's a bit as well where you're talking about this idea. I think for people listening that might not have got round to reading the book yet, I think it is fair to say that throughout the book you are very generous in giving parents and people the benefit of the doubt, in terms of like there are lots of phrases in here that are like, people are trying to be helpful, they're saying the wrong fucking thing, but they are trying to be helpful.
There isn't the swearing.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's me. I put that in there. I've sworn. But you have given people the benefit of the doubt and said, like, your parents are trying to be helpful, but they are going to say things like this that don't, and there's a bit in there where you're talking about that all of the advice and things that parents and school educators and school staff can do is basically changing behavior, but not what's going on in people's heads. And I have definitely felt that when I've come across material that is broadly about teenage burnout or about non-school attendance or whatever else, and it's not aimed at the people that are burnt out or that are not attending school. It's always aimed at the other people and going, here's how you can manipulate their behavior to get it to look like they're attending, get it to look like they're, so that's really... Did you find that was where you went first of all, was like, I'm going to speak to the people who are doing this and I'm going to really not focus on the outward things? Because a lot of the book is not about like what you're doing, but it's about how you feel and what your brain is going to be going through and all of those. It's very inner world. Do you know what I mean? Was that,
Yeah. What was exactly the question there? Tell me again.
I don't know. I guess to kind of ask, like, did you stumble in, not stumble, because I know you've written the book, writing the book intentionally, but did you sort of start writing and then go, oh, this is mostly going to be about inner world rather than outer pressures? Or was that something where you were like,
I
there's
think,
nothing out there for
yes.
this, I'm going?
No, I think it was more like I want to be able to show teenagers that there are different ways of thinking about this, and that there are, and that mindset shift. Because I meet a lot of I meet a lot of families and teenagers, but actually often more parents than the teenagers. But I sometimes think there are three groups broadly that I see. There's the home educating teenagers who are completely out of school and their parents have committed to home educating them. Then there are the ones who are unhappy at school, who are attending, but their parents are continuing to push. And then there are these ones who are in limbo, where they're not attending school, but everybody thinks they should be attending school, and they're not being home educated. And they are the ones who are in the most trouble, in my experience, because they think there's nothing left for them. They think there's no future. They think not only am I not going to school, but I am never going to amount to anything at all. So I was thinking of them, and I was thinking what might help to shift you. Not, I suppose the difference in this book and other books is that most books are thinking, how do I shift you to being a person who's going to school? And mine is more thinking, how can I shift you, help you shift to being a person who feels in control of their learning? Whatever that means, whether that means I'm going to go back to school because it's important to me, or I'm not going to go back to school, I'm going to learn these things. I thought, because that's, I think, the kind of the pivotal moment which makes the difference in terms of mental health, whether this teenager feels, actually, you know what, there's a future for me, or there's nothing. And I sometimes talk to parents and they're just, particularly if they've been fighting for years to get their child into school and the child has been going less and less and less and less and less, and now they're not going at all. Parents are really burnt out by it all, really upset about it all. And they're often very negative about it as well. So they're kind of like, they're doing absolutely nothing. They're completely wasting their life, and I'm like, they're listening to you and they're hearing that. And actually, is there a way we can flip that around a bit? Because I do know lots of home educated children who don't have any contact with school and who are quite happily getting on with their lives and learning things. So just not being at school isn't enough. Do you see what I mean? It's not enough to mean my life is over. I know that. And maybe that's because of my kind of background in home education that I know that.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to tell them that too.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about the sort of authorial voice of the book and the tone with which it's written, because as you're saying, I'm trying to help people to shift from one place to another. Did you think really hard about like the tone of your writing? Because I'm thinking about addressing teenagers directly, and when you were saying, often if it comes from a parent or whatever, then they're like not listening. You don't get it, you don't understand. And I noticed that you've written it in the third person, so you've used examples about yourself and Eliza as well, but you've written it, Naomi discovered when she was young rather than I. And I wondered whether that was a deliberate choice so that it comes across as less demanding. I certainly felt like it was a low demand read. Do you know what I mean by that? We
definitely set out to be a low demand read. Definitely. And that's one of the reasons there are so many illustrations and it's chopped up into lots of little bits. I wanted it to be a book that you could just kind of flick through and maybe see something that might be interesting for you. Because I think if you're in burnout, the last thing you want is a book that looks like something you've got to sit down and read your way
Here's
through.
a textbook. Enjoy.
Yes, exactly. That's what parents say. It's like, it would be great if only I could get my teenager to read it. But no, the idea was that the pictures are there. Yeah, the authorial voice is an interesting one. I did actually originally write it from I, and then because we put more bits with Eliza, and also this was one where she was very much involved with the writing as well. It wasn't just me doing the writing. And I think because we wanted to put in both my stories and Eliza's stories, we thought it's going to sound really strange if most of it's I from my stories, and then it's like, and Eliza is this. So how do we manage that? We can't. So it needs to be both of us. But I think one of the reasons I was keen to write this book right now is that I have teenagers right now. And so it was quite easy for me to think, okay, how can I talk directly to them at the level that they're at, but also try to avoid being too annoying? because they're really good at telling me when I'm really annoying. Or even, I'm not sure if I do that in this book, but sometimes when I'm writing for teenagers, just acknowledge that I'm being really annoying. So I'm really sorry, this is really annoying. Yes, I know. Just to kind of put it out there.
Teenagers can spot someone trying to be high status a mile off. They're like, no, not going for this.
Yeah, no, exactly. You're just being really irritating. Stop it. So yes, I suppose I've got a few short years where I've got to write all my stuff for teenagers, because right now I've got the teenagers to test it out on. And I'm not saying they don't read my stuff, so but it helps. So that kind of knowing where they're at and also how annoying adults can be.
There's a really good bit of the book that I enjoyed, which I hadn't come across in anything else, which, if you say about like empathizing and really understanding where people are, I've not seen any books for teenagers that I think show this level of empathy around social media, and particularly around the bits that you've got in this book about influencers and how they might be acting in a slightly predatory way and making you feel like they're the only ones that understand you, and teenagers getting kind of, who are particularly, I can imagine, if you are I'm going to use air quotes for people that can see, supposed to be in school but not going, you may also be consuming more media and social media than is typical, and so you then can get into this kind of, did you have to like research that kind of whole world? Did you, because I know there's some case studies and things but in the book, but what was the kind of investigating that whole area like?
The social media stuff.
Yeah,
that's interesting that you've brought that bit up, because that's something that I have seen in my clinical work a lot, that they come out of school and what they do is go into the social media, internet world. And I feel a bit like it's all happened so quickly for this generation, that this generation of teenagers are pretty well the first generation who really are just digital natives all the way, that smartphones are just ubiquitous from a very early age. And I feel like as parents, we're kind of running to catch up with that. Like we're trying to work out, oh gosh, what are the implications of this? And it's like happening on the ground. So there's not much research about it. I'm particularly interested in social influence and and social contagion, and how things, how ideas spread through social media, and particularly with teenagers. It's an area that I have a particular interest in. So I'd already researched that from an academic perspective. I can't remember if I talk about it in the Burnout book, but there are these studies they've done in Germany with teenagers showing that tics can spread across the internet. So Tourette's like tics.
Yeah.
There's pretty good research to show this is happening, that you watch enough TikToks and YouTube videos of people with Tourette's-like tics, and a certain proportion of young people will start to develop Tourette's-like tics. Wow. And it isn't Tourette syndrome, and it's not intentional. They're not doing it on purpose. But we are human, and we are very, very prone to social influence. And I just think it's something that we don't know enough about, and teenagers don't know enough about. So that's where that came from. And then also just the hearing about the experience of teenagers, and just, how difficult it could be. Because I sometimes meet families and they'll say, the child's come out of school, we thought that everything would be better, but it's really not. And then you discover that they're spending all their time in their room in the class WhatsApp groups, and everything is just continuing, just like they're just not getting out of the house now, but it's still all continuing exactly the same way. And I think parents often aren't switched on enough, and I would count myself in this as well, to those kind of private social media stuff. We're becoming a bit more aware of social media, in quotes, in that kind of influencer sort of world. But the world of private social media, WhatsApp groups, Discord servers, all of what goes on those, I think we're not really switched on enough to those. And I think it's emerging. The whole world is emerging as we go along.
It's so interesting, isn't it? You mentioned in the book about sort of online communities where they might appear to sort of embrace you and go, the reason why you're unhappy in this situation, or the reason why you don't fit in that place is because you're one of us. And you don't necessarily talk about the labels that might be being used, but that kind of like belonging, which obviously teenagers are craving, aren't they? That is that time of life where you want to belong to a social group, and you are trying to identify which social group might be right for you, and often you end up in the wrong one, and this kind of thing. And that's really tricky, isn't it? Because I think a lot of adults, I would say, myself included, have found online communities where that does apply, and it is really helpful. But obviously I can do other things with my time. I have to do other things with my time. I've got responsibilities and all the rest of it, and I might hopefully have a little bit more judgment about what the aim of that community might be. And so you talk about red flags, and you know, why are these groups saying that they know you really well and you belong there and that kind of thing? And I hadn't really heard about that kind of thing, so I was going to ask you if that happens a lot in the families that you're working with, that children are kind of...
I have, yes, and actually specifically ones that kind of undermine parents, say,
Right.
oh, your parents won't understand you like we do. And I've talked to parents whose teenagers start saying things and they're like, I don't know where you've got this from. You know, it's like it's a whole nother kind of, it's like different words that just don't really fit. Like, anyway, I have, and I think the thing to bear in mind, that the difference with teenagers is they're more vulnerable. They're at a stage of social identity formation in a way that we're not as adults. So with as an adult, you're looking for a group of people who you connect with. As a teenager, you're looking for who you are. And so there's an element of you defining yourself by other people, but there's also an element of those groups being mixed age, and you can't tell that in the same way online. So, you know, I find it interesting that there's a lot now about safeguarding, obviously, and who can be with who, and you know what kind of way can adults be with teenagers, for example. But then you've got these groups online. You actually have no idea how old anybody is, and they may be saying they're one age when they're another age. And I think all of that kind of thing is, you know, teenagers are vulnerable. If there are people in there who want to exploit them in certain ways, it's quite an easy environment to do that in. Of course, you don't want to scare them, because then they just say, "Stop! I'm fine." Go with it. But I think that is something that parents have to be aware of. Actually, that anytime, it's important for teenagers to be expanding and to be exploring themselves and to be exploring different identities. But it's also important that gets kind of reality check in the outside world. And I think when you've got groups that are specifically saying things like, your parents won't understand you, or, you know, your parents won't get it, we understand you better than your parents will, which they do say, then you're kind of cutting off that communication between the teenager and the parents, which I think is a really dangerous thing to do.
Yeah, and that feeds in. I mean, there's another, because some of the book is about kind of spotting these things, spotting these red flags and signs of burnout and signs of all these things. And then, you know, because I think the book is very optimistic in a lot of ways about, like, here's some things that you might do. You're very honest about, here's some speed bumps that might come up on your way to recovery. But I really liked the bit where there was a bit in the book where you're looking about, like, where's your space to recover, and looking at, like, the fact that if you've got pressure from yourself, also pressure from school, also pressure from your parents, finding and that's where I think, to me, that seems it's one of those things where, like, well, if your recovery space actually ends up accidentally being one of these online communities, you're sort of still wallowing in it. You're still you're not getting space. Can you tell people a little bit about that, like finding space to recover, and what you mean by that?
Lifting off the pressure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think of it literally lifting off the pressure, making space for yourself to recover. And that's hard to do, because when you're feeling under pressure, you often reach for the things that are easiest to do, which might well be scrolling on on your phone. We all know that. And unfortunately, that can be just meaning that you don't ever get that space, because also the online communities, I think, particularly for teenagers, but actually I think for adults as well, there's often a pressure to be a certain way. You know, we all learn very quickly what can be said and what can't be said. And I've been part of some lovely online communities in the past, which have then spectacularly erupted and fallen apart because people disagreed on quite minor issues often. But there can be an element of kind of, you must think like us, you must behave like us, you must be kind of almost like ideologically pure in what you say.
Which is exactly what they're getting at school. That's just conformity here and conformity here.
Just conform to this instead. Exactly. Just conform to what we're doing rather than conform to what they're doing. Yeah.
I really, I have to say, I really found the bit that resonated to me in terms of that, like, finding space thing. There's a bit we were talking about imagining yourself doing, I think it's you talking about you skiing.
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
But
I can't ski. Yeah.
but imagining there's a bit where you're sort of talking about like to re-regulate your nervous system, and talking
Yeah.
about imagining yourself doing something like with physical competency. I think that would be a way of
Feeling
summing
good
it up.
good at it. Yeah.
And I just thought that again, it's, you know, I feel like I've said it over and over again now. I have not come across anything before that's not, all the stuff that's about re-regulating that we normally see is about like separating mind and body, you know, like completely stilling your mind, your body, sorry, so that your mind has space to do the things. And like, as someone with a slightly wonky brain, if I still my body, that's not good for my brain.
Yeah.
But reading that, and you know, the description of like imagining your muscles tensing as you go skiing and the feeling of the wind, like, oh yeah, that's way more re-regulating. Is that something you've developed through your practice?
Yes, it is. So yeah, that's interesting that you brought that up, because so I'm a trauma therapist, and one of the exercises that we do with people is it's called a safe place. So we say, can you imagine somewhere where you feel safe? It's all about self-regulation. And typically with adults, we suggest things like sitting on a beach, or, you know, lying in a park, calm, peaceful, all that kind of thing. And I realised quite quickly, working with people who are mostly neurodivergent in some way, that for a lot of them, and particularly for children, but actually adults as well, just sitting still calmly in itself made it an unsafe place. Because, you know, children are being told all the time, sit still, don't move. They don't think that's safe. We think that's safe for them, but they don't think that's safe. So I started experimenting with asking them to just think of things where they felt really good about themselves. So like, I had one boy and it was about him playing football, and he would imagine himself playing football. And then I've had some kids and it's been them playing in a video game, and it's all embodied. And sometimes I might even get them to move. Let's move around. Let's do it. Let's pretend we're actually doing it. But I think it's one of those things where I think we've kind of imposed an adult idea of what we think regulation should be onto children. I was actually just talking to some parents just earlier today. One of them was saying that their 4-year-old was having some trouble at school, what was called dysregulated behaviour, and school were trying to teach him mindfulness and breathing exercises, and he doesn't like it. And I'm like, that's such an adult perspective, that what you need is mindfulness and breathing exercises.
Yeah, I think I maybe have a child brain, because I feel exactly the same.
I think lots of us have this kind of brain, because I also hate the kind of calm, sitting still. Yeah, definitely. I was working with a autistic teenager, and she was telling me about what early school was like for her. And she said, you know, when I was at nursery, we all had to rest every day. We had to lie down on these mats and have a rest.
Oh, God.
And she said it was like torture. She said it was awful. I couldn't tell the time, so I didn't know how long this rest was going to go on for. It went on for ages. I had to stay there completely rigid. It's like it was the most stressful time of the school day was rest time. And it's like, yes, adults think, what a great idea. They'll all lie down and have a rest. I mean, it's a pretty ridiculous idea anyway, isn't it? Lie them all down in rows in a nursery, and suddenly they'll all rest. But even so, it's just not how children regulate themselves. Children regulate themselves through movement.
But it's the most convenient way to get them to regulate.
If only they would. If only children would be convenient, hey? Then the world would be quite different.
Oh God, that's reminded me of working in a nursery where that had to happen.
Yeah.
And the children that clearly just really, really didn't want to do it, the nursery manager would be like, just pat them. Just pat them, and then they'll just become docile. Just keep patting. And I was like, this feels really weird.
When does just patting someone become Chinese water torture? Where's the line between
like sensory? Yeah.
Oh, this was in Australia. It was very odd.
Keep them down, presumably.
Yeah, just pat them really firmly.
Push every time they try and jump up. Just pat them down again.
I'm going to try that later. I'm going to, just as my wife's going to bed, I'm just going to keep just tapping her with a single finger. I go, it's relaxing. Yes. You're relaxed.
Stay completely still.
Yeah.
I
wanted. I also had that sort of question about that, imagery that you're talking about, and also you say about imagining putting your negative feelings in a container, and then imagine that. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because some people from different approaches might think opposite to that. I might say, oh, you need to let these feelings out. You need to, talk about it and stuff. And you're saying about putting them into a container and then do this positive imagery. Will you tell us a bit about it?
So the idea of the container is actually to kind of honour the negative thoughts as well. It's not about I must get them away and push them away and never think about them. It's like, okay, these are swimming around my head all the time and they're stopping me from doing things. How about if just right now, to give myself a bit of a break, I imagine putting them in here, but I know they're here, and I think I might even suggest you could actually write them down and put them there.
Yeah.
So that we know they're there and we know they're important, but means that we can do something else for now. You see? So it's like because I mean, the book isn't therapy, it's self-help. In therapy, I would use that technique in therapy at the end of a session with somebody. So if somebody, we've talked about lots of very traumatic things, I'm a trauma therapist. At the end of the session, I might say to somebody, could we put those things in a container? And I might even say, I'll keep them. I have had, like with children, I might actually have a container and we'll say, we'll keep them here. I'll keep them here for you until next week. So next week we can come in. So I'm
not going back to see Naomi. She's got a horrible box of all my. If I just leave it, it's gone. No, if I don't come back, it's gone.
But then trauma therapy is all about thinking about those thoughts and facing those thoughts. But I think trauma therapy isn't something that teenagers can do for themselves either.
Yeah, definitely.
I think it's yeah.
Can I ask about a bit in the book where you're talking about this, and this is a bit where you have kind of focused in on like maybe school is not the right environment, just broadly. And there's a bit again, lots of the book resonated. A book where you're talking about the best grades versus interests. And you're personally saying you had an interest in these things. I also ended up doing a music degree because it was the easiest degree I could get, because I didn't think I would have to work for it, and I didn't. But it was also a degree where I went and did it, and anything where I was like, oh, I would like to learn this, and it was like, okay, but you're not going to be good at it, and we're going to assess you very hard. And I was like, okay. I'm just gonna stay in this very easy.
I'll stay in my comfort zone.
Can you speak a little bit about that? About like, why is that system there?
I think the system incentivizes us to do that, and I think the earlier that we start assessing children, particularly with high stakes testing, the earlier we stop them from being able to freely learn about things, because if you always make learning about evaluation and doing well, then you are always going to incentivize everybody to choose the easy options. And there's research that shows that people do this. So there's research that shows that with teenagers, if you give them a test and you give them a list of questions and you tell them it really matters what mark you get here, they'll choose the easiest questions. If you say to them, this is just about learning and about whatever interests you most, they'll choose the harder questions. So it makes so much sense when you think about it like that.
Yeah.
And yet our whole system is set up to incentivize people to choose the easy option, because you think that result you get at the end is the important thing, don't you? You think the grade you get or passing is more important than actually what did I learn. And I think it comes because we don't really trust humans to want to learn. We think, or the school system thinks, they must be incentivized by these grades at the end. We can't ever think that they would just do it. I mean, I think one of the things that happened to me was that so I went to university to study medicine, actually. And then in my third year, luckily for me, my university, we did our first 2 years, and then we had a gap year, effectively. It was at university, but it was an intercalated year where we could choose anything else before we went on to clinical school.
Nice.
It was really nice. And you could do literally anything. Like somebody did Chinese, somebody else did engineering. You could really do anything. And it didn't matter. As long as you passed, all you had to do is pass. You could still go on to go to medical school. And I chose psychology, and it was the first time in my whole educational career, so the last year of my undergraduate degree, that I'd been able to choose something without any consequences. Like there was no, oh, you better do this because you'll need to do this later, or you better choose that you don't want to risk getting a B when you might get an A, because it was like, as long as I pass it, doesn't matter. I'm going to carry on. And I absolutely loved the psychology. And it was like a whole different experience. I was like, oh my goodness, learning could be so different when I'm actually learning things that I want to learn about. And then, of course, the irony was I did much better in that than the medicine, dropped out of medicine, went off with a psychologist. But it was like, I felt, looking back on it now, it's like, we need that experience so much earlier, because many people never make it to the third year of a degree, but also most people, even in their degree, don't get that choice. I was just really lucky that I was in that particular. Otherwise, who knows, I might be an unhappy doctor somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah, and I feel like that's the kind of opportunity that if we're lucky as an adult, sort of financially and with life situations, that's the approach to learning that a lot of adults I know take. They're like, do you know what? I'm just really interested in this thing. So I'm going to go do a master's in witchcraft and ancient ritual because I'm just really interested in it. Or, you know, and it's such a thrill. People get so excited about it because, as you say, the pressure isn't there. You're doing it for your own interest. But, you know, obviously you've got to have the money and the situation that allows you to do that. And teenagers, just don't get that opportunity to choose.
But often from the outside, well, that's what I was going to say, Wem, is that I think we sometimes undersell how much importance agency has in that enjoyment, in that like intrinsic motivation, because a lot of the time what I hear from parents of teenagers is they look at it from the outside and they go, I would love to spend a day doing a bit of French and a bit of art and a bit of whatever. And it's kind of this really over romanticized adult idea of like, oh, I'm a Renaissance person and I do this. And it's like, no, you don't get to choose what French you do. Yeah. There is a linear track and you have to do it. And then there is a linear track of art and you have to do the thing. And like, yes, you are moving and potentially exploring all these different maybe interests, but the system also has all of these things you're not interested in that you also have to do. And like the few lessons that you are probably interested in don't outweigh the, you know, I reckon 60% of the curriculums that you're probably not interested in. You know, how can teenagers like convey that back to parents without sounding ungrateful? I guess
it's more like, would they love to spend their day being made to do a bit of French, then being made to do a bit of art, then being made to do a bit of English? Would that be really what they'd like to do?
While under assessment the whole time?
Well, being assessed and always on somebody else's terms. So not what would you like to study in English? What are the books you really find interesting? But these are the books we're going to study. Not what language would you really like to learn and how would you like to learn it, but we're learning French and this is how we do it. So zero agency. And whenever you take away agency, you make learning less fun. That's just.
I think that is one of the big things that potentially the forest school pedagogy has. That I think a lot of us are very hyper cautious of whenever it comes up in our kind of circles. Is if someone mentions that like the school has asked me to do a bit of a Vikings theme or a school, and like forest school as a pedagogy doesn't have curriculums, doesn't have this stuff, and I think there's that like agency and assessment and stuff where we're like, oh, a lot of us, I think, would say, don't really want it in our house. We're going to keep forest school to be this thing that is like, here we are, we're going to hold space for you. There are all these things, because otherwise you end up with like nature also being like, didn't like French, didn't like PE, didn't like nature, you know?
Yes. And what is there left? But also I think with forest school, isn't there the issue that if forest school is compulsory, it's different too. Like if you oblige people to do forest school, that's very different to doing forest school because you want to do it.
I think it is, and I think it's one of the things that Wem and I have been on a bit of a, I was going to say a bit of a bender about, a bit of a like mission for over the last years. It's like separating that idea that like nature and being outdoors is synonymous with like hardship and endurance, because sometimes those things unintentionally people put them together and they're like, forest school's great because they're out in all weathers and they're doing this, and it's like this slightly masochistic kind of like we get through it, and that is absolutely like if you're forced to do that, it's exactly the same. And I think where we've been really working on our site is like setting up shelters that are full of like cushions and blankets and books, and they are out of the wind. And so like some days there are kids where like if you really like nailed it down to like, are they outside? Well, they probably go from this shelter where they're with cushions and reading books, and then they might go up here and we've got a couple of board games, and like they're in the middle of a woods, right? They're in the middle of a forest. They are doing forest school. Some people will really disagree with me on this. I would say they are doing forest school, but with the most amount of agency that we can give them. Whereas I think if you are, like you say, if it's compulsory that you go and sit in the corner of the school field that's completely exposed, on some little tree stumps in wet weather gear, like, yes,
Yeah.
okay.
Or and it's about, we're all very obsessed with content, aren't we? That's the thing. It's like people have this idea, presumably with forest school, of things like, they should be whittling, or they should be making fires, or they should be doing these things. And with
the
children,
things I've seen on Instagram, that's what it is.
You've got to do it. And if you're not doing it, I always, this is one of my big missions in life, is to say there's a huge difference between doing something because you want to do it and doing something because you're being made to do it. But the two things may look exactly the same. You can't necessarily see from the outside. You've got a group of kids, half of them are doing forest school because they love it and they want to be there. The other half have been forced to do it, or have even been sent as a punishment because they're bad, No,
they're called interventions. They're not called punishments, They're called interventions.
I was joking slightly, but I was also thinking about how the child sees it, right? How if the child thinks that that's what they're being sent for, then they're gonna have a different relationship with what they're doing.
And there's a bit, I think it's towards the end of the book, where you've got a whole chapter about like quitting is good. Quitting things is very good, and making
another bit you probably don't see much about in other books for teenagers.
Yeah, let's talk about why quitting is good.
Quitting is amazing. The funny thing is, I think for children and teenagers, we are generally obsessed with not letting them stop things. It's all about, we've got to get them to stick at it. We've got to keep, they've signed up, they said they wanted to do it, they can't drop out. And people say things like, how will they ever learn to stick at things if I don't make them? Then you get to adulthood, and there are so many adults who really struggle to say no to things, to quit things, even when it's really clear it's very damaging for them. They're just like, but I don't want to drop out. I don't want to let other people down. They can't say no. And I think we need to honour our children's no's a lot more and see quitting as a skill in itself. So see something like, actually, I think I've got out of that. In fact, I was talking to a little boy. He's in the Different Way to Learn a different way to learn about forest school. I think you probably noticed it when you read the Different Way to Learn. The little boy who went to forest school 3 times and then said, "I've done it now. I've done it. That's it." And his mum said, "The idea is you keep going." He's like, "No, I've done it. I've done what I need to do. I'm going to stop." And I think that's a real honouring of that child's no, which then opens the door in the future for him to go, maybe I'll give it another try, because I know I can quit.
Yeah.
And I meet so many children who don't really think they can start things because they're worried that if they do start, their parent will be like, "Well, I've signed you up now, you're going." And we stop. It's another way of stopping them experimenting, a bit like the grades. It sort of cuts off your options, because you don't want to. I know as an adult, I don't necessarily want to commit to doing something for a whole term or even a year or even several years just because I started it off. I'd like to be able to say no thanks. One of the things I'm practicing for myself is quitting books halfway through. When I have a thing about finishing a book, even though I reckon most of the good stuff in books is often in the first half.
Yeah.
Do you know what? I still tell people, Wem, I'm going to big you up here, because this is the thing. So Wem's children are a bit older than mine, and so there have been many conversations Wem and I have had where I've gone, my kid's doing this, what's going on? Wem is incredible, and said that in that thing of like not quitting or not, how long do you want to go? Going, if you reframe those, because sometimes for me it's the financial thing. We're not super well off at all, and so it's the burden is in the like, oh my god, but I've paid for like quite a lot of lessons. Is there any chance you can? But Wem said you told me to frame it as, I have paid for the opportunity for them to go. That's what I have paid for, and like that's. Like, I'm still poor, don't worry. But like, but the mental freedom of like, oh no, you're right. That is what I wanted to do. I wanted them to have the option to go today. And again, it's that like breaking that cycle of like linear education in terms of like, well, if you stop now and take 6 months off, the classes are going to keep going and you'll have lost time and you'll be behind. And rather than going like, well, some of this stuff can be, you do it for a bit, you come back, you do it for a bit. How many adults do we know that that's their relationship with like exercise or, a particular like food regime where they're like, do it for a bit, then it's too much,
And also, like, if you don't allow people to quit, then you're robbing them of the experience of what it feels like to quit, including times where there's a bit of regret attached to that. Yes. So I was, when I was a kid, I hated going to ballet, and I was forced to go to ballet for years and years and years and years. And then I sort of stopped complaining about it, but I always hated it. And then my mum came in when I was about 11 and said, oh, I've been thinking about it. And I think you're right. I think you can quit ballet now. And I had to say, okay, great, thanks. Because I'd been asking to quit for such a long time. But by that time, I was secretly quite enjoying it. And I was sort of like regretting quitting it. But I had to quit because she hadn't let me quit. And then I look back on it now and I'm like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have quit that thing. But that's also a really useful learning experience, isn't it? It's like investigating the reasons why you want to quit. Are you quitting because you really don't enjoy it? Or are you quitting it because one of your mates is saying we could do this other thing at the same time? Or, or are you quitting it because you're a bit lazy and you can't be asked? Or, so to experience...
It's knowing yourself. It's
Yeah.
learning to know yourself, and again, I think the best time to experiment with that is in childhood and when you're a teenager, because the consequences are less severe. It's like people get really worried about them quitting swimming lessons and things. And you're like, actually, knowing when you need to quit could save them from burnout in adulthood. The stakes rise. They don't get less high as in adulthood. They are higher. So what better time to practice that? And you're right. I also think the same. It's good to be able to say, actually, or maybe child says, oh, I don't want to go, I don't want to go to that. And you say, okay, you don't need to go. And then they're a bit bored. And then, actually, I kind of wish I'd gone. That's fine. They've had that. They're having that experience of, okay, that was the decision you made.
Yeah.
And I think
it's that thing again, isn't it? Of like, it's that thing again of like, you can control people's behaviors. You can drag them to the lesson. You can make them stand there, but you cannot change what's going on inside. And actually, you're talking about consequences, and there's a really good bit in the book where, again, in that sort of that recovery kind of bit where you talk about the thing that will probably come up as you make the first step out of burnout is people will say things like, oh, well, if you can go to the shop, you should really be if you can go to X, you should really be, because they've got this hierarchy of things of, well, this is the most important. So that's where you've got to get to, and actually not giving people the autonomy to go like, this is the scope I've got today. And, or without having to like super in-depth defend, like, yeah, the shop is not the same as going to school because of the social pressures, and I don't get a detention if I go to the shop wrong, and I get all of that stuff. Is that I imagine that must come up a lot in your work, of that thing of people feeling like my child can do X, so why can't they go to school?
Absolutely, all the time, and also the teenagers as well. I can't go out because it's not just parents who say this, is it? If you go to the local shop, there's a chance that the person in the local shop will say, "Oh, you're not at school today, but you're well enough to be here." It's like you have to be ill. You have to be literally in bed to make it worth it. You can't just be actually. I'm not well enough for school. School isn't the right place for me to be right now. But I'm okay. And I think that's a really difficult position for teenagers to be in. Like, okay, it was a bit like, I felt like that myself when I was a teenager. I'm okay as long as I'm not in school. And then I'm not okay anymore.
Well, also that has ripples, doesn't it? Because that, like, not to get on too much of a soapbox, but there is a lot of stuff in the adult world where people go, look, if you're stable enough to do X, or if you've got then you shouldn't be taking this benefit, or you should be working X amount, or you should, that stuff starts with this kind of
totally
school.
Does. If you can do this, you should be able to do this. Yes, you can do this thing that you want to do, so you should be able to do this thing that actually makes you ill, or that you really don't want to do. It's like the agency thing again, I think, is important.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, Naomi, I'm conscious we could, and now the soapbox has come out, and so I've caught myself and gone, no, because it will just get higher and higher.
Stand down, Lewis. Stand down.
I will go like all this way now. Naomi, thank you so much. Is there anything that we haven't covered about this book that you're like, we really must talk about this thing? I know there's so much more in it that we could keep going into.
No, I think just the illustrations. It's important to mention that there are loads of illustrations in it. Like, it's probably, but they're cartoons. So they're witty cartoons, and exactly. They are not kind of, it doesn't make the book childish.
No,
I think it does really lighten the book. And so I think if you think your teenager won't read it, leave it around and let them flick through it. And actually, it was a bit inspired by one of the reasons I wanted to do it was when I did the Different Way to Learn book about neurodiversity and self-directed education. It just has very few illustrations. I think it's got 12. And several people sent me pictures of their children and teenagers looking through the pictures and saying, oh, look at that, and laughing at them and thinking they were funny. And I was like, okay, I think there's something here that illustrations just draw you into a book, don't they?
Yeah,
Yes, they definitely
absolutely. I would just like to say before you finish as well that I found the book really useful to read as a parent of children that aren't quite teenagers yet, but it's not far off in terms of being aware of what the signs of burnout might look like, and when it's just, I don't want to go to school because I'm a bit tired, and when it's actually the beginning of burnout. And I thought that was, I kind of felt safe that I'd read it, you know, a bit of a like, that, you know, here's what might happen, here's what to look out for. Even though it's addressed to teenagers, I still really felt the value of reading the whole thing myself as an adult. And then also that thing of like, and it will be okay. So here's what to watch for you and your kids so that you don't continue to traumatize them and go, off you go to school. I mean, it's quite interesting that my son more than once went, why have you got that book about me? Why have you got that book for me?
Wow.
And I was like, oh, dude, like, it's not for you, actually. It's nothing to do with you. But he automatically saw that it was for him, which is good, right? Because it really shows that the cover and the appearance of the book is sort of speaking to him. But yes, I find it really reassuring that, like, you know, you can spot these things. There is another way. It'll be all right. There is a road out of it. And so thank you to you and Eliza for writing something that's, so useful.
Thank you. It's really nice to hear.
Naomi, you're very active on social media, on LinkedIn, on all these things. Is there any way you want to direct people that have listened to all of this? Obviously, go and buy the Teenager's Guide to Burnout, but is there anywhere else that you want to send people if they want to find out more about what you're up to?
So I have a free Substack called Think Again. And if you sign up for that, you'll get a message from me every Monday-ish into your email inbox. So if you're not a social media fan, then that is a good way to keep up with what I'm doing. It's also a really good way to share my content with other people, because the thing about things like Facebook and Instagram is you put all these posts and then they just disappear into the ether. It's really hard to find them. So Think Again is the Substack is naomicfisher.substack.com, I think.
Brilliant. I shall be subscribing to that immediately.
Oh, amazing. Naomi, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time and can't wait to see what you're up to next.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me again.